Today we have our very own Bill Hankins with us. A little background on Bill: a lawyer by training, he began his career as a special assistant United States attorney. After returning to the private sector and earning his MBA, he worked with a private investment fund and began holding leadership roles in growth stage companies as they navigated the challenges of scaling. In doing that, Bill recognized his passion for serving the unique needs of entrepreneurs in fast-growing companies, so he founded a firm that specializes in providing legal and strategic business counsel to organizations across multiple industries. All of this prior to his role now as a certified Petra coach. So with all of that in mind, Bill has experienced a great deal of communication throughout his career in different settings, with different groups of people. And one of the most important things that he's learned is there's a difference between being a great talker and a great communicator. This includes everything from heading up a meeting to the little nuances you don't even realize you do every day. So the next hour, Bill's going to share 6 key, often overlooked principles and underlying techniques that you can begin using immediately to enhance your communication skills and elevate both your personal and professional interactions. So just a reminder for everyone on here, this is an interactive session. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A box and the chat box. We encourage you to use those as much as you possibly can. And then also this is being recorded and you will all receive it afterwards. So if there aren't any questions, I'm going to go ahead and let Bill start.
All right, Leah, thank you so much. And hello, everyone. Like Leah said, communication has been one of those topics that I've been interested in for most of my adult life. And I'm very excited to do this webinar with you today and appreciate everybody tuning in and sharing your time. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and I want to go ahead and get started. I want to get moving with an initial question. I want you to tell me, on a scale of 0 to 10, how do you rate your own communication skills? Now, I want you to put in the chat box. We're going to use a 0 if your skills are absolutely horrible, and we're going to use a 10. 10 means I can't get any better. So you're going to be somewhere between 0 and 10. Drop that number in chat right now. All right. Got a 5, got some 7s, 5. All right. Appreciate the honesty here. This is good. All right. Keep them coming. I love asking this question. It's like asking people to rate their cooking or their driving skills. We tend to think we're a lot better at communication than we really are, right? So today, we're going to talk about what makes somebody a great communicator. And I want to pause here and make a key distinction. I'm not talking about what makes somebody a great speaker. Just because someone speaks well doesn't always make them effective communicators. So for example, a great speaker, they might know how to craft strong arguments, deliver their message, move their audiences. And those things by themselves result in more of a one-way communication and a short-lived connection with listeners. And you see this in politics a lot. You know, somebody saying, vote for me or support this policy. A great communicator, on the other hand, they put the listener before the message. So for them, the focus is on creating a dialogue. And the outcome is a two-way communication, and you have a much deeper connection to the listener. So today, the focus of this webinar will be about communication in business. And to be an effective leader, you have to have strong communication skills. Those two things go hand in hand. And oddly enough, this is a skill that's usually overlooked despite the impact it can have on an organization. So you think about the impact poor communication can have on an organization. The Economist did a study years ago, and they found that the most significant consequences of poor communication inside of business included delay or failure to complete a project, which impacts productivity, low company morale, that impacts your culture, missed performance goals, that impacts your people, and failure to close sales, and that impacts your revenues. So there's really no area of the company that's spared by poor communication by its leaders. There's good news though. Communication skills are just like any other business skills. They can be learned and they can be improved, but you got to put in the work. So today I want to share with you 6 key principles of effective communication. And they are active listening, empathy, understanding different communication styles, body language, speaking confidently, and communicating with clarity. Now, the first 3 in the orange circles, those are all about understanding. And the last 3 in the gray circles, those are about being understood. And I use this framework and I like it because it ties in very well with one of the 7 habits of highly effective people. And that's seek first to understand, then be understood. And if you only take one thing away from today, that principle can revolutionize the way that you communicate. And if you haven't read the 7 habits, highly recommend that book. As we go through these 6 areas today, we're going to talk about some things you can start doing to improve your own skills that will help you become a more effective communicator in your own organization. And we'll cover these at a high level. So some of these skills you may already excel in. Others may be areas where you need to work. So the goal is for you to be aware of how all these different communication techniques work together to make you a more effective communicator. So if you have any questions as we go through the webinar, like Leah said, just drop them in the chat box and we'll get to them. So let's talk about the first principle. Active listening. The first principle has absolutely nothing to do with speaking. It's all about listening. And I put it here in this number 1 spot because it's foundational to everything we're going to talk about today. So people often think of listening as some sort of passive activity. It's what you do while you wait for your turn to talk. But in fact, the opposite is true. I love this quote by the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. He said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." And this is a rule that all great communicators follow. So why is active listening important? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but some of the top ones include that it communicates to the other party that you care about what they're saying, and it builds trust. It helps the speaker get their message across, and it allows you to draw out information that might not otherwise be shared, and it can potentially lead to better ideas and outcomes. So I want to ask you, here's another chance to jump into chat here. What do you think makes somebody a good listener? What are some characteristics? Just throw, 1 or 2 words in there, characteristics that describe good listeners. All right, calm, participation. What else? No interruption, checks for understanding. I love it. I love it. Engage through body language, focus. Okay, this is going to be fun because this is going to resonate with you all as I start going through some of this. So there was a study that was published by the Harvard Business Review, and it identified the skills that participants thought made managers effective listeners. And there were 4 characteristics that really stood out. And I think there were like 3,400 participants in this. They said that effective listeners ask questions and they dig for deeper insights. They create an environment where the other person feels safe, supported, and able to discuss different viewpoints openly. They treat conversations as something that's cooperative. So you have feedback that really flows smoothly, and the parties don't get defensive about comments made by the others. So it's not competitive like a debate. And then also effective listeners provide feedback in a way that the other person accepts. That 4th one might have a little bit more to do with the listener's ability in delivering feedback. But really, in short, these 4 characteristics are all about creating active conversations. And I think we had some people that put this in chat. It's all about active conversations and a comfortable environment where the listener doesn't hijack the conversation. So I want to talk about several techniques that you can immediately start doing that are going to help you create this kind of engagement we're talking about. The first, practice being in the moment. Have you ever found yourself in a conversation and you're just nodding along, but in the back of your head, you are thinking about 100 other things that you need to be doing? I gotta return this phone call. I need to go pick up the dry cleaning. I gotta do this. I gotta do that. And you're just checked out. I mean, we've all done it. It happens. The funny thing is, though, we think we're getting away with it in these conversations, but the problem is the other person usually picks up on it, whether they call you out or not. And even the slightest little delay in a reaction, that's a dead giveaway that you're not in the moment. And think about it, how many times have you caught somebody doing this in a conversation? And in fairness, it can be really hard to keep your brain focused on just one thing. Human beings, they tend to speak on average of about 125 to 150 words a minute. The brain, though, can process about 600 words a minute. That means the brain sometimes gets so far ahead of the speaker that it checks out and it starts looking for other things to focus on. So there are a few things you can do to engage your brain and get into the moment. The first thing is stop thinking about your response and focus on what the other person is saying. All right. This is one of our biggest challenges in communication. We don't listen to understand. We listen to respond. We don't listen to understand. We listen to respond. So focus on understanding what that other person's saying. And it can help to repeat their points in your head while they're talking. Just kind of treat it like a game. There's another thing you can do if your mind starts drifting, and it's picking a focal point. There's a book, it's called The Charisma Myth by Olivia Fox Carbane. And she says that when you find your mind drifting during a conversation, think about your toes. And I know it sounds kind of weird, but it forces your brain to make a sweep of your body and it pulls you into the present moment. Another simple thing you can do is just maintain eye contact. And I don't mean a death stare. I just mean, regular eye contact, because that forces you, whether you like it or not, to pay closer attention to what the other person is saying. The next thing you can do, next technique here, is ask clarifying questions. So sometimes when another person's talking, their message isn't as clear as we would like it to be, and it's probably not going to be as clear as they would like it to be either. When this happens, don't be afraid to ask clarifying questions like, "I'm hearing you say this. Is that correct? Help me understand what you mean by this. Tell me more." The simple act of asking questions will help that other person get their intended points across, but it's also going to help show that you care enough about what they're saying to ask questions so that you can understand. After all, one of our fundamental needs in life is simply to know that we're being heard. So that's what these questions will do. Third technique is avoid the temptation to interject. This is a tough urge for all of us to overcome. But to be an active listener, no matter what you do not cut the speaker off, finish their sentences for them. Don't jump in and start problem solving. Don't correct their facts or their logic while they're speaking. I mean, how many of us find that incredibly annoying when that happens? I'm sure there's a lot of head nodding out there. I want you to remember, active listening, it's about engaging the other person. It's about understanding what they're saying. And you can't adequately respond unless you first understand that message. Next is pay attention to the speaker's body language. Active listening is not only about hearing what is said, but it's also about hearing what's not said. Studies show that somewhere between about, I think it's 70 to 93% of all communication is nonverbal. We're constantly transmitting what we feel inside, even if we don't realize it. Here are a couple of examples. If you're talking to somebody and you notice their arms or legs are crossed, it can be a sign that person is not mentally or emotionally open to that interaction with you. It can mean that their mind is unconsciously creating, some kind of physical barrier between the two of you. It's a defensive move. There was a study done by the authors of a book called How to Read a Person Like a Book, and they videotaped 2,000 negotiations. And not one negotiation ended with an agreement where one of the parties had their legs crossed. Not a single negotiation was reached, an agreement was reached where the parties had their legs crossed. Now, that just tells a lot right there. Now, the flip side of what I'm saying is that if the other person's body language is open, then that indicates they're comfortable with the interaction. Another thing to look for is mirroring. And this is pretty cool. If the other person starts to mimic your actions, so for example, you tilt your head, they tilt their head, you smile, they smile, maybe they adopt the posture that you're in, that can be an unconscious tell that they feel a bond with you and that they're engaged in that conversation. It can also suggest that they're open and receptive to whatever you're saying, whatever that message is. Now, all of these actions that I'm talking about, these are unintentional and they can be very telling. And I have to caution you though, none of this is 100% true all the time. There can be factors that come into play like maybe environment, maybe something that the person's going through emotionally or physically that can impact their body language. So by themselves, these clues won't be enough to tell you exactly what somebody's thinking, but they may be enough of a signal to let you know that there's enough, that there's another message that's being sent. So they're worth paying attention to. And later on, we'll go into more detail about body language as it relates to the signals that you send out when you're talking in a one-on-one conversation or you're giving presentations. The key takeaways here are, these are all simple techniques that you can use to become better at active listening. And they seem really simple and they seem really straightforward, but most people just don't do them. So let's move on to the second principle here, and that is empathy. Now, you can't pick up a personal development book or a leadership development book these days that doesn't express the importance of having empathy. And it's usually ranked as one of the top skills you can develop as a leader. It's crucial for understanding other people. So what exactly is empathy? You hear the term tossed around a lot. Empathy is the ability to stand in somebody else's shoes, to see the world through their eyes, to understand how their emotions and needs impact their perceptions and actions. So that's what you're connecting there, their emotions and needs to how they perceive things and how they act. A lot of times when we interact, it's at a superficial level. We interact with people as they appear to us with a version of themselves that they're projecting to the world. And most of the time, we just don't dig deeper. There's a story that Stephen Covey tells in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And it does a great job illustrating exactly what empathy is. He tells the story of being in New York one Sunday morning in the subway, and it's all quiet, handful of passengers in his subway car. And it comes to a stop. A man comes in and he has some kids, and the man sits down next to Covey, and the kids are just running wild. They're going up and down the subway car, just driving people crazy. And Covey turns to the man and he says, "Sir, your children are really disturbing a lot of people. I wonder if you couldn't just control them a little bit more." And the man is in a daze and he just looks up and he says, "Oh, you're right. I guess I should do something about it. You see, we just came from the hospital where their mother died about an hour ago. And I don't know what to think. And I guess they don't know how to handle it either." And at that moment, Covey saw things differently. And because he saw them differently, he thought differently. And because he thought differently, he felt differently. And then he behaved differently. So his irritation vanished, and all of a sudden he's filled with compassion. And because Covey internalized what that man said, and he saw his situation from a different perspective, everything changed. He asked the man, he said, "Tell me how I can help. Tell me more about what's going on." That is empathy. And that's what I'm talking about here. So how do we develop empathy, particularly with regard to our own communication? The good news is it's already baked in our DNA. People want to connect with other people. But for some reason, we suppress all this when we get into business settings. We marginalize it as one of those fuzzy skills, maybe even a sign of weakness. But here are a few things you can start doing right now that will help you exercise that empathy muscle. First of all, recall your own experiences. So maybe you're having a conversation with someone at work. They're having a challenging situation. Maybe it's directly tied to their job. Ask yourself, have I been through something similar? How would I feel if this happened to me? How would that impact the way that I see things or how I do my job? Just by recalling those situations, you can put yourself in the other person's shoes. Second thing you can do is listen. Remember how I said at the beginning, listening is the common foundation through all these principles we're talking about. The active listening skills that we talked about are the most important skills for becoming more empathetic. It's all about, attending to that basic human need to let people know that they matter and they're being heard. The next thing is acknowledge other viewpoints. This is where people tend to get confused. Acknowledging other viewpoints doesn't mean you have to agree with everything the other person is saying. That's not it at all. It's about recognizing the other person's perspective and understanding the why behind it. That's what you're trying to get to, is the why behind it. And number 4, ask yourself or allow yourself to be vulnerable, authentic, and sincere. A big part of empathy is developing trust, and you are never going to gain trust if you are not authentic and sincere. That's just a really simple one. And I want to say this, wrapping up just this empathy part, developing empathy is particularly important right now after the last 2 years we've had with COVID and with lockdowns. You have no clue as to the challenges that your employees or your teammates might be facing that impact their own mindset at work and how they're doing their jobs. So stepping into their shoes, understanding where they're coming from, that will enhance the quality of your own interactions, and it's going to build a level of trust between you and your team. Let's talk about understanding different communication styles. So a few years ago, The Economist did a survey, and you can tell I love The Economist here. I do a lot of great surveys. They did a survey to find out what were the root causes of poor communication in the workplace. And the results showed a lot of the usual responses. People said, well, it's poor leadership, unclear responsibilities, company culture. But the number 1 rated cause of poor communication in the workplace was due to different communication styles. And it makes sense. How many times have you been in a meeting and you feel like you're just repeating yourself over and over and over, and you start thinking, my gosh, what's wrong with these people? Well, the answer is that there's nothing wrong with your teammates. It's just most likely due to the fact you're speaking different languages and you don't even realize it. Everyone has a unique style of communicating, and that style is impacted by experiences, personalities, environment, and communicating to everybody in the same way is going to be a fast track to confusion and misunderstanding. And at Petra, we see this situation in companies often. And the good news is that there are tools that you and your team can use to understand everybody's different communication styles. And just to give you an example, the tool we use is called the DISC assessment. And many of you may be familiar with this or have even tried it before. The DISC assessment identifies 4 different personality types. And every one of those personality types has its own unique style of communicating. And by understanding your style and then understanding the different styles of your team members, you can learn how to communicate more effectively with each other. And you can already tell just by looking at this chart, you probably can connect the dots as to what style you are and maybe even what styles other members of your team have. So for example, if you're a dominance type, you can't communicate the same way to somebody who's an influence type or a conscientious type. You're just speaking different languages. So DISC allows you to gain a lot of insight there and learn how to tailor your communications much better. Key takeaway here, I don't want to go into a lot of detail on DISC. That's not the point of this comment. I just want you to be aware you can't communicate with everyone using the same style. And if you ignore this, you increase that likelihood of miscommunication and conflict. So save yourself the stress and just take the time to understand your style. Pick a tool that works for you and use it. So what we've covered are the first three principles, which are all about understanding. The next three I want to move into are about your own communication style and how you can be better understood. So the first piece is body language. So earlier, we touched on a few of the language cues that you can watch to better understand somebody who's speaking to you. To be an effective communicator, it is equally important to understand the signals that you send through your own body language. I want you to think about all the interactions you have every day, whether it's at home, at work, on Zoom, with friends, with strangers we pass on the street. Remember, 70 to 93% of what we convey is actually through things like facial expressions and gestures and just how we stand and how we move. And I want you to think about how much weight that you give to nonverbals. And you may not have given this much thought, but imagine a scenario. Imagine you're talking to your spouse or your significant other, and they walk into the room, they're breathing heavy, their jaws are clenched, they start pacing and they're fidgeting and, showing a lot of nervous energy. And you say, "Are you okay?" And they look at you and say, "Oh, yeah, I'm great." What are you giving more weight to? What they say or how they act? It's going to be how they act. Entire courses are taught on this subject. But for our purposes today, I want to focus on three kinds of body language that you can easily start focusing on that will improve your communication immediately. It's eye contact, body positioning, and gestures. So let's talk about eye contact. After the voice, your eyes are the most important tool you have for communicating. Your eyes can completely change the tone or the meaning of a conversation. So I want you to imagine something. Imagine you're striking up a conversation with somebody that you just met at a party. Maybe you're talking about the host or you're talking about how bad the wine is. I don't know, but just imagine you're having a conversation. And I want you to imagine three different versions of that exact conversation, but the only thing that's going to change in each scenario is what you do with your eyes. So here's the first scenario. While you're talking, you constantly break eye contact with the person and you look around the room, left and right. You're looking over their shoulder. Your eyes are constantly shifting. What is the real message you're sending there? Drop your thoughts into chat. What is that message that you're sending? Not everybody at once. Not interested, not paying full attention. That's right. Maybe you're sending a message that this conversation is boring you, that you would rather be talking to somebody more important in the room. Okay. So we're all on the right track here. Now let's change the scenario. Same conversation. While you're talking this time, you're looking down at the floor. You occasionally look up, but then you just constantly look down at the floor. What kind of message are you sending here? Go ahead and throw some thoughts into chat. Annoyed? Mm-hmm. Not engaged? Right. Bored? Nervous? Right. You're sending a lot of messages that are on very similar paths here. Maybe you're sending the signal that, you just don't want to be in that conversation, that you're intimidated, you're nervous, a lot of different things. Now let's tweak the scenario one more time. And while you're talking, You never break eye contact. You just stare deep into that other person's eyes and you're not blinking. What's the message here? I love it, Paulina. You're a creep, aggressive, angry, too much coffee that morning. Yeah, you're probably coming across as aggressive and probably a little psychotic. Regardless of what it is, you're going to be making that other person really uneasy. A stare can also come across as overcompensation, like you're working to conceal something. In each of these conversations, though, the eyes alone took the conversation in 3 totally different directions by sending different messages. So you see right there just how powerful the eyes are when you're communicating. So what's the best way to make eye contact? The key is to maintain steady but not overbearing eye contact while you're listening and speaking. So a good rule of thumb, if you're having a face-to-face conversation, don't feel like you've got to stare in that person's eyes for 100% of the time. Like we said in the last example, it's creepy, it's aggressive. What you want to do is you want to maintain a gaze for about 5 seconds and then slowly move your eyes away and then return that gaze back. As a listener, you want to focus on that 5-second rule. If you're the speaker, it's natural to look away a little bit more, but just remember that 5-second rule. Now, this skill takes practice and it can be uncomfortable for a lot of people at first. If you're uncomfortable with this direct eye contact and the 5-second rule, practice looking around or between the eyes until you become more comfortable. To the other person, it looks like you're looking at them in the eyes regardless. If you're looking at them right here at the bridge of the nose, it still looks like you're looking at them in the eyes, but it's a good way to get acclimated to doing this better. The same rule applies if you are speaking like in a meeting or you're giving a presentation. Make eye contact with individuals in the audience for about 5 seconds or for the length of a thought, and then shift your gaze to someone in another area of the room and just repeat the process. Just don't go on the same, path over and over where you look like an oscillating fan. You want to maintain eye contact with as many people in the audience as possible. And if this makes you uncomfortable, which again, a lot of people don't like doing this in presentations, one trick you can do, look at foreheads. I know it sounds strange, but to the audience, it looks like you're making eye contact. Another tip, if you're in a meeting, avoid relying on PowerPoint or your notes, because that automatically forces you to break eye contact. You want to be looking at your audience for about 99% of the time. And the simple act of making steady eye contact, it can be a very effective way to keep somebody's attention, to keep the audience engaged. And it's also one of the fastest ways you can create rapport with someone, whether it's one-on-one or when you're speaking within a group. Next, let's talk about body positioning. This is a fun one. So when we're in a conversation, we're speaking to a group or we're leading a meeting, one of the last things we tend to think about is how we use our body. We tend to let our bodies go on autopilot. For you to be an effective communicator, you have to pay as much attention to the message your body is sending as you do to the words you're saying. So the first thing is eliminate those barriers. We touched on this briefly earlier. Avoid creating barriers between you and the other person or you and your audience with things like, clasped hands, the prayer hands, folded arms, hands in your pockets. All these things send a subconscious message to the other person or to your audience that you're closed off. It just creates an unnecessary barrier for you in getting that message across. Second thing is get into the right posture. Don't be rigid, don't be robotic. That's the default position of people who are not comfortable in front of a group. It's just keep it simple. Stand like a normal person, keep those feet about shoulder width apart, keep the knees soft and unlocked, hands to your side. the more natural and open your posture is, the more relaxed you're going to be, the easier you can breathe, and it's going to put your audience at ease too. The third thing to keep in mind is minimize your movements. This applies mainly to when you're speaking to a group. Say you're, giving a presentation at a board meeting, or, speaking to 100 people, whatever the case is. When you talk in front of a group, your adrenaline is naturally going to kick in. It does it for everybody, regardless of how many times you do it. Our bodies want to find ways to get rid of that nervous energy somehow. And here's the problem. Motion will always draw attention, whether it's intended or not. When you move during a presentation, that's going to trigger heightened attention from your audience. And a good rule of thumb is don't move unless you have a reason. So that means don't fidget, don't, adjust your clothes, don't adjust your hair. Speakers are usually unaware that they're doing this. Not only is it distracting, but it also communicates that, you're nervous. And when it communicates that you're nervous, that makes the listener uneasy too. If you tend to walk around a stage or a conference room when you're talking, make sure that when you change your location, it ties in with your message. So for example, if you step forward, that tends to indicate to the audience you're making an important point. When you take a step backward, it communicates you've concluded a point. Shifting to the right, shifting to the left, usually indicates that you're transitioning points. So just keep in mind those things, but whatever you do, make sure you have a reason for whatever movement you're making. And that bleeds into what we're going to talk about with gesturing. Your hands can be excellent tools for communication if they're used in the right way. If they're not, they can become your worst enemies. Keys to remember: your default posture needs to be hands down at your side. And when you gesture, keep the hands about at waist height. That's the space you want to live in. Make sure you're using gestures that are natural to you. So don't force gestures, because when you do, your audience will pick up on it and you're not going to come across as authentic. And you see this happen a lot of times. People are mimicking gestures that they've seen somebody else do, and they just don't nail it right, and it comes across weird. Also, keep the gesture spontaneous, because it's all about timing. If you rehearse a gesture before a presentation, and then you get into the presentation and you slightly miss your mark just a little bit, again, you're going to look awkward. And then lastly, avoid threatening gestures. And avoid threatening gestures. Politicians are masters at this. Remember, open palms. It puts listeners at ease and it draws them in. It conveys honesty. It says, hey, I'm not hiding anything from you. And also avoid the pointed finger. This is a big one. That's why you see politicians do that thumb wrap. The pointed finger is a very aggressive move, and it does not put your listener at ease. The key takeaway here is that your body communicates more than the words that are coming out of your mouth. So if you remember these techniques with your eyes, with your body, with your gestures, you're going to enhance your message and not detract from it. Jumping into the next section about speaking confidently. This is a big one. People tend to judge your confidence in the first few seconds that you open your mouth. You're being judged not just on what you're saying, but on how you're saying it. The ability to speak confidently is one of the most common traits among all the great communicators. And you think about anybody that you consider a great communicator, that's going to be the common thread. This is a skill everybody admires, everybody wants to have, but few people realize it's a skill that you can develop really easily by just practicing a few simple things. First, slow down. One of the most common mistakes we make in both conversations and when giving a presentation is we talk too fast. And when we do, we come across as insecure. We come across as nervous. We sound like we just want the whole experience to come to an end, right? Speaking too fast also causes your vocal pitch to rise. And when that happens, that can that can have the unintended effect of causing your listener to downgrade the importance of what you're saying. The solution is just to practice using a relaxed and deliberate pitch and cadence. That alone can demonstrate that you're in control of the situation, and it gives your words more weight. Next tip, speak with authority. You ever find yourself starting a sentence off with tentative language like, I'm sorry, but, or I'd just like to say that, or it's my opinion that? Anytime you start off a sentence with this kind of tentative language when you're speaking, it diminishes your perceived confidence and authority. So instead of starting sentences with these phrases, just state your thoughts as fact. So for example, if you're in a meeting, instead of saying, in my opinion, I think our policy should be this. Just say, our policy should be this. See the subtle difference that stating something as a fact can make? It increases that perceived confidence. Also, avoid uptalk, or you may hear the word upspeak. Have you ever been in a conversation with somebody and they make a statement, but then their voice creeps up at the end? And then you're looking at them like, are you asking me or are you telling me? Here are a couple of examples on the screen. I will have that report ready tomorrow. Well, you have that uptalk at the end and it sounds like a question instead of a direct statement. Same thing with the other example. We should move forward on this project. It sounds like you're asking a question. Using uptalk can make you sound less assertive and confident. So to avoid this, just practice ending your sentences on a downward inflection. So I will have that report ready tomorrow. We should move forward on this project. It communicates more confidence in what you're saying. These are just little easy things you can fix in your communication. Also, avoid using filler words. All right, filler words like those things creep into our conversation and our speech patterns, and it's all unconscious, really. And it happens a lot when we're thinking about what we're going to say next. And I want you to imagine if Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address this way. So 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are like created equal. Now, I'm exaggerating here in this example, but I want to make a point. You know how the Gettysburg Address should sound. And do you see how much fillers can detract from a message? I mean, if Lincoln talked like that, this wouldn't be in the history books. Using these words make you sound like you don't know what's going to come next in your own thought process. So the best way to break this habit, let's see, I see the one I'm hearing a lot instead is people saying right after every other sentence. Exactly. That's becoming a big one. I hear that a lot with people too. And it's funny because when people start doing this, you start counting it in your head. I've been in conversations with people who use the word like too much, and I stop listening to what they're saying and I just start counting the number of likes. It's incredibly distracting. So the best way to break this habit is just, like I said, slow your speaking down so that your mouth doesn't get too far ahead of your brain. And instead of looking for other words to replace these fillers, silence is a great option. Another way to break the habit is just ask somebody close to you to listen for you using those kind of words. It's going to help you become more aware whenever you're using them. Next, learn to use pauses. Pauses are amazing tools to use in both conversations and presentations. And the reason is people get really uncomfortable with silence. It's human nature. So by using a pause, you automatically get the listener's attention. You can use the opportunity to make a point, to let your message sink in. You can also use pauses to grab and reinforce the audience's attention during a presentation. A persuasion trick is to use the pause and nod. This is kind of cool. When you make a point, pause, then nod your head. And when you do this, you're going to find that your listener or your audience will start nodding along with you. It's a subtle but effective persuasion technique, little Jedi mind trick for you there. So how do you use these? 3 simple rules. Pause at the end of a normal sentence, where a period would be if you were reading it on paper, reading your sentence on paper. Pause after you make a key point for emphasis. Pause when you're listing things or going through a series. Just good rules of thumb. And then this takes us into the 6th principle, which is communicate with clarity. A common issue that I often hear when coaching organizations is that leaders do not communicate clearly. So lack of clarity leaves room for interpretation. Where there's room for interpretation, there's room for error and misunderstanding. How many arguments start with the words, "Well, I thought you meant this"? So what can you do to infuse clarity into how you communicate? First thing, meet your audience where they are. Imagine if you had to explain something like gravity to an adult and a toddler. Would you approach them? Would you approach the topic in the same way? No. You would make assumptions about each person's level of understanding and their ability to comprehend, and then you would adjust what you say accordingly. Here are a few questions you can ask yourself. Just these are going to apply to whether you're speaking to one person or 100 people. First thing you need to think of is, what does your audience want or need to know? Second, what's going to get in your way of getting your message across? Could it be a language barrier, technical know-how, age difference? You hear people talking all the time about boomers talking to millennials, different languages. So understand what could get in your way. Also, how can you make your message more personal so the other person can relate? Is there a story that you can tell that they can relate to? Or how does what you're saying apply to the company as a whole? Think about how you're relating your key points in a way that's relative or relevant to your audience. Next, be concise. I love the FDR quote. He said, "Be sincere, be brief, and be seated." A big mistake is that people think the more they talk, the smarter they sound. And the opposite really happens. The more long-winded somebody is, the more other people start to doubt that person's ability to organize their own thoughts. When you're concise and you can get to the point in presentations and meetings and conversations, people will pay attention and they'll remember what you say because your words are going to have more impact. So a few tips here is, if you fall into this trap often, ask yourself first, why do you do it? Are you wanting to impress? Do you like the attention that comes with having more airtime in a meeting? Do you only do it around certain people? Just understanding why and when you do it, you're going to become more aware of this bad habit. Second tip is always lead with your main point, your main idea first, because people will anchor their thoughts on your first key point. So imagine starting your comment or your presentation by saying, if you only remember one thing today, this is it. Lead with that main point first. And then once you do that, focus on the relevant details only. Our tendency is to over-explain. But remember, most people don't want to go through the effort of processing a lot of data and bullet points. They prefer not to be overwhelmed with information. And so keeping your supporting points, your relevant details to a minimum only helps you getting that message across. Next, use plain language. This is big. Einstein said, if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. And we all know those people who have the uncanny ability to take something really simple and explain it in the most convoluted way possible. What happened? What do they do? What are some of those things that people do to make their message convoluted? Throw it in chat. What do you think? And Deb, I see your question here for a couple of minutes ago. These rules are going to be spot on with virtual meetings. They're going to translate very well. Definitely incorporate them. Okay, so people add too much detail. They try to sound smart. Yep, use per our discussion. You hear that a lot in meetings. I just put up some examples here. These are what I call the big three offenders. So people who are too wordy. For example, if somebody says, I reached out and connected with her, why can't you just be simple and say, I called her? Or people who use big words, they say, I prefer utilizing enormous idioms to fabricate intelligence. Why don't you just say, I use big words to sound smart? Passive language, the work was done by Bob. Just say Bob did the work. Remember the phrase Eli 5, the acronym Eli 5. It stands for explain like I'm 5 years old. If you can do that and you can avoid these big three offenders, these bad habits, your communication is going to dramatically improve and you're going to communicate with much more clarity. Keep the language simple. And then next, be specific about your desired outcomes and timelines. So for example, look at the two statements on the screen. The one on the left says, we're going to increase revenues. The one on the right says, we're going to increase revenues 20% by June 30. And we're going to do this by offering this new product and entering this new market. You see just how much specificity helps. In the first example on the left, you're forcing that listener to make an assumption about the path forward. By giving a specific and measurable statement with a timeline, you're being clear and you're cutting out the number of assumptions somebody has to make to fill in the blanks in their head. So you're avoiding the chance you're going to have miscommunication and confusion. So remember, if the listener does not understand you, that's on you. It's up to identify your communication weaknesses and improve on them. So we have covered a lot of territory in a very short period of time. And I hope what you got out of it was seeing how all these principles, how all these techniques connect. And I want to challenge you to think about how you scored yourself on those communication abilities at the very start of this webinar. How are you going to improve? If you gave yourself a 6, think about which of these techniques you need to start focusing on and putting into practice today to raise that score. Improving on these skills, it's not hard. You just have to do the work, and now's the time to start. So I'm glad to open up for questions in the couple of minutes we have left.
Yeah, if you guys will just enter any questions you have for Bill in the chat below. I want to thank you guys for attending today. You'll all receive a recap in the next 24 hours, and it'll include all the resources that Bill mentioned and a link to rewatch this and to share it with your team. Be sure to check out petracoach.com/Petra events to see all of our other upcoming workshops and webinar opportunities. I know at the beginning, Bill talked about the personality or communication style assessment that we use at Petra. There's a workshop next month coming up about that. And as always, if you have any further questions or there's anything we can help you with, reach out at info@petracoach.com. Bill, thank you so much for being with us today, and everyone have a great rest of your Monday.
Thank you. Hope you all do the same. Thanks.